Okay, so I am going to introduce our presenter today, who is William Henry. He is the Vice President of Volunteers Insurance Service Association. He's an expert in insurance and risk management for nonprofits, communication, marketing, client relations, and a number of other specialties. Today's topic is what could go wrong, managing the risks of volunteer engagement. So with that, I want to thank you for being here, William, and I will pass it on to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Josie. Yeah, it's great to be with everyone today. Lots of people interested in this topic. Um, I'm William Henry. I'm happy to be with you on behalf of Volunteers Insurance Service Association, or as our friends call us, VIS. We provide insurance and risk management services to protect the volunteers of nonprofits and also public entities that engage volunteers nationwide. So today we're going to discuss the risks that go with activity and what you can do to deal with those risks. If you have questions as we go along, please use the chat box. It looks like people are doing that already. And I'll stop a couple of times to answer them. And we'll also have time for some Q&A before we wrap up the session. Over the 50 years that our volunteer insurance program has worked, we've seen certain kinds of claims repeatedly, as well as some that are more unusual. So today, as we'll look at how these claims occur and what you can do to prevent them. At the end of the session, you'll know how to identify risks that are specific to your own organization, how to minimize them, and when something bad happens despite your best efforts, how you can deal with it. Just as important, you'll know how to keep the risk management effort going strong, even as your staff and your volunteers come and go. So I'd like to start by asking you 6 questions about what you already do to manage volunteer risks. Keep score of how many yes answers you have to these questions. Have you analyzed tasks that volunteers perform from the standpoint of safety for them and for others around them? Do you interview volunteers to learn what skills they do or do not have and assign the work accordingly? Do you inspect the locations where they're assigned for potential hazards such as falls, fire, or poor lighting? Do you train volunteers to ensure that they can perform their tasks skillfully and safely? Are supervisors assigned to volunteers, and are they held accountable for making sure volunteers perform their assignments as they have been trained? And the last question is, do you have a specific action plan in the event a volunteer is injured, injures someone, or damages someone's property? Now, if you did not have 100% yes answers, or you weren't sure about some of those questions, I definitely can help you today. All right, these are the 4 categories of claims we see in our volunteer insurance program. Today, as we go through the session, I want you to think about what your volunteers do and write down all the scenarios where a volunteer could be injured, injure someone else, damage someone's property, or commit a dishonest act that hurts the organization. In a phrase, what could possibly go wrong? Now, I'm sure most of you are positive people most of the time, but sometimes you have to think negatively in order to keep negative things from happening. So we'll do some negative thinking today. I'll get it going by giving you some examples of actual claims we've seen in our program. Let's start with injuries to the volunteer. Falling is the most common type of accident that causes injury claims with volunteers. To prevent falls, you have to look at the environment where the volunteer will be assigned, whether it's a location you see every day or another location where the volunteer is assigned. If it's possible for the supervisor to scout the locations where volunteers will be assigned, that's best. But if it isn't possible, tell your volunteers you want them to be your eyes and ears at those locations and report any conditions that might cause an injury to the volunteer or to anyone else. Designate a person to whom the volunteer can report, a person who will make sure those hazards are eliminated, either doing the work themselves or perhaps assigning it to another capable volunteer. All right, so what kinds of hazards are we looking for that might cause a fall? Is there clutter on the floor? Boxes left where people walk? Are there loose rugs, extension cords, poor lighting on stairways, loose handrails? We've had insurance claims caused by those kinds of falls. So if you think about your tasks volunteers do they ever have to reach anything up high, even occasionally? Make sure there are ladders or step stools easily available. If the volunteer is working outside your facility where there's no ladder or stool, have the volunteer bring one from home. They can just leave it in their vehicle until it's needed. Do your volunteers have to carry things up and down stairs? One hand should always be free to use the handrail. Don't carry anything heavy enough to require both hands. That's inviting a fall, so take 2 trips with smaller loads instead. Now, you might be thinking all this is very obvious, but I'm just telling you that we see claims all the time resulting from these kinds of hazards. So it's something to watch for. So here's a truth to keep in mind about your risk management program. You might be familiar with the territory, but the new volunteer is not. So make sure volunteers are mentally prepared for anything that's different from what they're accustomed to. So are you imagining some ways already that a volunteer might fall as you think about the assignments they have? You might be surprised how expensive these come in can be also. By the time you bill the doctor and hospital charges, prescription drugs, physical therapy, and all the rest, you can get into several $1,000s very quickly. All right, so let's look at other kinds of injuries besides falls. Do your volunteers have to move things, especially heavy things? A volunteer was hauling furniture in a pickup once. The truck was full and the load was not balanced well. When he tried to take the first piece out of the truck, the load shifted and knocked him out of the truck. His leg was broken. So think about how you could prevent something like that. You just make more trips instead of overloading the truck, or maybe a bigger truck is an option. Some training and the use of ropes to secure the load also might be in order. In management, always look for the simplest, most practical solution. Usually it's the right one. There's no magic in risk management. There's just some assembly required. Now, when volunteers have to lift things and carry things, what's the big risk there? If you're thinking back injury, you are right. So make sure volunteers know how to lift properly. Lift with the legs, not with the back. And maybe the loads they're carrying should be smaller too. Maybe hand trucks, dollies, or other materials handling equipment are needed. We've developed some 1-page and 2-page documents on a variety of subjects. We call them our preventer papers. These are good for safety training, either in small groups, there we go, or just to give to volunteers individually. You can see on the screen there how to get those. All right, so let's look at some other kinds of injury claims. If your volunteers use tools in their work, have them show you that they know how to use them, not just tell you they do. One volunteer was trying to pull a nail from a board for the very first time. Instead of prying it out, she tried to pull it straight out and straight toward her face. So she hit herself in the mouth, caused a lot of dental work. It was unnecessary. If her supervisor had just taken 1 minute of training, either to train her or to verify that she knew how to pull a nail, all that could have been avoided. So if you have volunteers who have certain skills, designate them to have training responsibility for new volunteers. It's good for both. It reinforces the veteran volunteers' skills and knowledge and trains the new person. All right, what else results in injury claims? Well, we've seen claims resulting from injuries while volunteers are working outdoors. They might be doing home repairs or landscaping. Many times those accidents can be prevented just by requiring volunteers to wear long sleeves, gloves, safety glasses, the right kind of shoes, gloves. Anytime your volunteers are using cutting tools or handling sharp materials, require that they wear leather gloves. And you don't have to provide them, just tell them to bring them. They will. We've seen claims for allergic reactions to bee stings, poison ivy, and pollen. So again, protective clothing can help, and maybe a mask. But maybe the volunteer who has allergy issues should be assigned to do something indoors, or maybe provide transportation services at least at certain times of the year. By the way, it's okay to ask about allergies or any other medical condition or physical limitation that might affect their ability to carry out a task safely. Volunteers will appreciate the concern, and you can prevent some problems. All right, I'm going to pause right here for any questions that we have about falls, safe lifting, outdoor work, or the use of tools.
Feel free to pop those into the chat if anybody has additional questions. I provided the link that we saw on that one slide in the chat as well. But yeah, feel free to pop any questions in the chat.
Okay, and we can, if there aren't any right now, we can come back to them later. I think we'll have time for that. Take time to watch your volunteers in action and correct them if they're doing something that's unsafe. I know everybody's busy, but there's always time for safety. Just let the volunteer know that you want everyone to work safely so no one gets hurt. If you say it with an attitude of helpfulness, they'll appreciate the message and they'll be more aware of hazards. Safety training is like any other. You have to express yourself in the best way for the information to be accepted. People sometimes forget what you say, but they always remember how you made them feel when you said it. Conduct safety training regularly, and volunteers will become more safety conscious. It will become part of your organization's culture. All right, are we doing some negative thinking yet as we think about accidents that can happen to volunteers? All right, so let's move away from injuries and talk about liability. The L word. I hear it all the time. What's our liability if we do this? What we want to do would serve our mission, but what about the liability? Or perhaps from the volunteer's point of view, someone would like to volunteer, but if they're working directly with clients, especially, what's the liability? You know, fear of the unknown is understandable. The good news is that liability can be managed, and you can put that L word in its place. So what does the word mean? Liability is a situation in which the volunteer and/or the organization is held responsible for bodily injury or property damage. There are other kinds of liability, but for this session, we will stick to bodily injury and property damage. If there's a lawsuit, it will say that your volunteer was negligent or your organization itself was negligent. Now, here's a working definition of what that word means. You might want to write this down. Negligence means you did not do something you should have known to do, or you did something you should have known not to do. Did something you should have known not to do, or you didn't do something you should have known to do. If you did not properly screen, train, or supervise the volunteer who's involved, that is how liability might extend to your organization. And we'll talk about training and supervising a little later. You know, the charges might not be valid. People are sued all the time for things they didn't do, but it's important to create an environment where the chances of a liability claim are as low as you can make them. Sometimes claims in our insurance program arise out of situations involving vulnerable people, such as children, the elderly, or those with chronic illness or disabilities. Some of you might serve those kinds of clients. It's good risk management to perform criminal background checks on any volunteer who would be working with vulnerable clients. I know you probably do that. Sterling Volunteers is one good provider of screening services. Sterling is a partner of VIS. Now, background checks are good, but they're not enough. You know, you might have a volunteer who's never been arrested or investigated for anything, but still might injure a client. There might be a verbal assault if the volunteer loses his or her temper, or it could be a physical assault. It doesn't happen often, but we have had claims in which volunteers lost their temper and struck people in their care. So you have to have rules on what volunteers can and cannot do, and then communicate those rules and enforce them. I hear a lot about empowering volunteers to decide for themselves how to carry out their assignments. That doesn't work in risk management. If volunteers don't have instructions from you, they might react to situations the same way they would with their own family members. Their way might be okay and it might not. So don't leave them to their own devices. Just scrub that word empowerment from your risk management vocabulary. For example, We suggest that you have written procedures for how volunteers should defuse a situation where the person in their care becomes agitated or even verbally abusive to a volunteer. It might not happen often, but it's best to have the volunteer mentally prepared for any situation where tension might be high and emotions could take over their actions. Just like you want them to be mentally prepared for hazards that could cause an injury to the volunteers, you also want them mentally prepared for situations that could escalate into their hurting someone else or being accused of doing that. All right, here's another type of liability claim we had. An elderly man was injured when he fell out of his wheelchair that was being pushed by a volunteer. He was afraid the chair was going too fast, so he put his feet out to stop it and was thrown out. If we had seen it, all of us probably would have agreed that actually the chair was traveling at a safe speed. But the man in the chair didn't think so, and that's really all that matters. So ask if the speed is okay and take time to listen. Elderly people who are fragile can be very fearful of injury. So make sure your safety training includes how to communicate effectively with clients. Bodily injury also includes sexual abuse and molestation, and that has to be a concern to any organization that works with vulnerable populations. As I said before, sometimes accusations are false, but even if you are blameless, you still have to defend yourself. That can be very expensive, both financially and in terms of reputation and the distraction that the incident causes. Insurance comes into play, but do what you can to reduce the risk that an incident will occur or that a volunteer is in a position where he or she could be falsely accused. Require background checks, certainly, for any volunteers working with vulnerable individuals. Have written procedures and take time to explain them. Having procedures designed to prevent bodily harm helps you in two important ways. One, you can make sure volunteers are consistent in how they deal with those they're caring for. And two, you'll discourage any people who have bad intent and want to volunteer for your organization. The more of those people, the more likely they'll walk away and leave you alone. In the last part of this session, we'll get into just how to decide the procedures that are right for you. There's a method that works and anyone can apply it. All right, before we move on to the next area of risk, does anyone have any questions about liability, bodily injury, or property damage?
So there were a number of questions that came through the chat about both the injuries topic and the liability topic. Would it be helpful if I read those out to you?
Yes, please. Let's take a pause and do that.
Okay, great. So the first one was more of like sounds like a question to everybody. So I'll just flag that if anybody's not watching the chat, which is somebody asked if anyone had a standard incident report document to share. And there were a few answers that came in for that. So just keep an eye on the chat for that. The first question for you is, are there HIPAA concerns when asking about medical conditions to be aware of?
No. This is information that the volunteer willingly shares, taking the initiative to share it as a condition of volunteering. And you're doing it for their personal protection. No, there's not any HIPAA concern.
Okay. And then what is the appropriate way to address a medical concern that would limit someone to assist with volunteering?
It just depends on, just like with the Americans with Disability Act and employment, it just depends on what the issue is. If a volunteer has a physical limitation, perhaps they don't go into the field. What other opportunities to support the organization can you offer? Are they a good planner? Maybe they could help with planning an event that you're having. Maybe they would be good at fundraising. Any number or scheduling. They would be the better impact go-to person, perhaps. Just think about all the things that volunteers can do to support your organization, and you'll find something for most people who want to get involved.
Okay. And then in reference to when you talked about having volunteers demonstrate that they know how to use tools, somebody asked, how could a leader do this if they have a group of 20 to 25 people?
Have everybody show up an hour early. Yeah. Because the last thing you want to do is have somebody using a cordless circular saw, maybe even out of your sight, and you have no idea whether they know which end of that saw cuts. There's just there's no other way to go than to take your time. Now, you can have many people. This is a great opportunity for group training. You can have the skillful volunteer demonstrate, then have each of the volunteers show that they have been paying attention and that they know how to use that tool safely. But yeah, if this is a good reason for, and we'll get into this later on the orientation form, what skills do the volunteers already have? So, you know, if you have, well, here's a good example. High school kids have to do community service, right? As part of their graduation requirements in many states. So you have them come early, you have the trained volunteers show them what to do, and you put some forethought into it. What kind of tools are we going to let these kids use? You might keep the skill saw away from them. They might be more of the rake or paintbrush persuasion for their particular one day that they'll be with you. Just take some thought about, okay, who are we going to have participating and what do they already know? I hope that answered it somewhat.
Yeah.
What else?
Are volunteers blanket insured through nonprofit insurance policy, or does it need to be added?
Yeah, I don't know if I have time to get into this much today, but what we advise is that, well, here's what most of you have if you have a general liability policy that protects your organization. Volunteers will be covered at no additional premium. That sounds like a good idea, but it's really not. And here's the reason. You have a specific limit of liability, perhaps $1 million per occurrence. $2 million aggregate would be typical for your general liability policy. If a volunteer causes an injury, causes a liability incident, that volunteer can have access to the entire limits of your policy, which means that if both the volunteer and the organization are sued, you will be underinsured if the judgment or the settlement goes over the limit. Where's that additional money coming from? Out of your pocket? You know, most organizations don't have a convenient way to come up with several $100,000. So the solution is to take volunteers off of your general liability policy. There's an easy way to do that and insure them separately. Here's where I get into the only promotion of my organization I'm going to give you today. Our program allows you to insure volunteers separately and very inexpensively, so that if they cause an incident, your general liability policy is untouched. You preserve your entire not for the volunteer. Meanwhile, our program provides up to $1 million to protect that volunteer if he or she is charged with in a liability lawsuit. Now, you'll see our web address at the end of the presentation. You can click on that and get all the details. But that is our advice to any nonprofit organization. Keep your volunteers insured separately. Okay, what other questions?
The last two are
For
related
the
to each other.
liability part.
Yeah, the last two are related to each other, so I'm just gonna read them both. What is the responsibility of an organization if there is a hold harmless signed agreement? And how effective are indemnity agreements, hold harmless agreements with volunteers when a lawsuit occurs?
I'll tell you the only benefit of a waiver or hold harmless, whatever you want to call it, it tends to focus the volunteers' attention on the fact that there are risks, but please do not rely on those to protect your organization. They've often been struck down in court. The judge will say, well, this agreement is construed too much in favor of the organization and not the volunteer, so I'm going to let this lawsuit proceed. Very, very limited value in a waiver of liability or hold harmless document. I'm not saying don't use it. I'm just saying that don't depend on it to protect you.
Okay, that was the last question. There are some, again, I'll encourage folks to read the chat. There are some answers coming in from other people as what their organizations do for these different questions. So please feel free to read through those in the chat. And
Okay.
that was the last one that I had for those topics.
All right, then let's move on. It looks like my PowerPoint is smoothed out now. Let's move on to auto liability. I imagine some of you have volunteers who drive their own vehicles to transport clients for medical appointments, shopping, visitation, other places they need to go, or perhaps you're just hauling supplies from one place to another. From the claims that we've seen in our program, accidents at intersections are the most common kind. Left turns when you don't have the right of way, turning from the wrong lane, running stop signs, those kinds of things. Poor visibility in inclement weather is another frequent cause. Sometimes, unfortunately, these accidents are very serious. A volunteer who was insured in our program turned left in front of an oncoming vehicle. She was killed, and the two occupants of the other vehicle were seriously injured. And there have been other very serious accidents when the volunteers were at fault. Now, getting motor vehicle records is a very good idea to make sure your volunteers haven't had serious violations. The same as with background checks, getting motor vehicle records can help if your organization is sued for something the volunteer did, because it demonstrates that you did your due diligence. That can charge of negligence. And when you protect yourself against charges of negligence, it reduces your what? Your liability. Where vehicle safety inspection is required, put each volunteer's vehicle inspection date on your calendar and ask them for a copy of the certificate every year. By the way, vehicle-related accidents don't always occur in traffic. We had a claim resulting from a fatality in a parking lot. The volunteer did not realize the client was and backed over her. Now, how could that have been prevented? Remember what I said about looking for the simplest solution? If there had been a rule that the volunteer could not leave the parking spot until the client was safely buckled in, the client might be alive today. In another claim, a client tried to get into the volunteer's car while the car was in gear. The volunteer's foot slipped off the brake, and the client fell and broke her leg. Think about how that could have been prevented. If the volunteer had been trained to keep her doors locked unless the car was in park, the client would not have been able to open the door and try to get in. So consider having a written test on requirements like that volunteers must pass before they can transport anyone for you. As with so many of the risks we're talking about today, awareness and communication are the keys. Those preventer papers I mentioned, the one-pagers on safety subjects, we have 24 papers on vehicle safety, and they're all available to VIS members 24/7 on our website. We also have an online vehicle safety training program that we developed. It's designed specifically for volunteers. It's the only one of its kind, and it's free for all VIS members. All right, the last of the four most common risks I want to mention today is dishonesty. What access do your volunteers, or your staff for that matter, have to bank information and other sensitive data that might present an opportunity for embezzling funds? It happens sometimes. It happened recently to a major state association of volunteer managers. Almost always it's a big surprise. The thief is someone who was trusted. We won't get into this risk area in detail today. We do have a document available to our members on how to minimize this risk. All right, now, before we get into how to develop a system to prevent all these bad things, any final questions on what we've covered so far? I've left everybody stunned.
Feel free to put some questions in the chat. Let's just give folks 1 minute here to see if anybody has any questions to add to the chat. If volunteers are not transporting clients, but just themselves to and from locations, what things should we consider?
You know, it would be a good idea to give those volunteers the same safety training information that they would have in clients. These documents that we've created are usually 1 or 2 pages. The online course that I mentioned can be taken in about an hour. It's a self-paced online course. Um, and even if the volunteer is not on duty, you want them to be safe. And these resources can be a good refresher, sort of like taking driver's education all over again, but with an emphasis on volunteer responsibility. So the more you share safety information with your volunteers, the more that does to help create that culture of safety that we all want to go for. Anything else?
Yeah, a couple more came through. Apart from doing a criminal record check, how could you prevent dishonesty?
The document that I mentioned goes into some of this. One big thing is separation of duties. You don't have the same person opening the mail that has checks and depositing those checks with no one else having a look. For checks that you're issuing or payments, checks are kind of passe now, but for anyone issuing payments over a certain amount, don't have one person responsible. Have two people that have to sign off on those expenditures. Have people take vacations. Some of these dishonesty cases had one thing in common, and that is the culprit never wanted to go on vacation and leave anyone else in charge of what they'd been doing with the money.
Mm.
So those are some things to watch for.
Great. In relation to somebody who has volunteers working in senior homes, she says that it's difficult to monitor all risks. Are we covered if we go over global risks beforehand?
Are you covered? Well, one good thing to do is if you're working in that one facility, have the organization named as an additional insured. That's the term of art. Have an additional insured on the organization, the senior center's own policy. That's a common practice. It protects both organizations. And you could have the senior center added as an additional insured on the nonprofit organization's policy for that matter. But there's always time before the activity begins, to have a meeting about, okay, what are we being asked to do? What help do we have from the inside? And in a minute, we're going to get into risk scenarios. And this would be a great opportunity, what we're going to talk about in a minute. When you're working with another organization and there are vulnerable people involved, it opens up a whole world of risk scenarios that need to be thought out and addressed. So let's get into that.
There's one other question that's come up a couple times, which is that
Okay.
Asking about the liability guidelines applying across in Canada as well as the US, and can Canadians become a VIS member?
Unfortunately, our program for the insurance is not available to Canadian organizations. The resources on our website are. You might remember a screen that showed that for $25 a year, you can have access to all of those resources. So that is available. Unfortunately, our insurance program is only available in the US, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia.
I think that was all of the questions.
Okay, so this slide shows the basic steps to addressing that title question, what could possibly go wrong. We've done some risk identification today. We reviewed various injury and liability scenarios. That's the first step. What comes next is deciding what risk you should worry about most and which ones you can accept. And then determine how you can reduce or eliminate the most serious ones. Insurance is for serious risks that you cannot eliminate entirely. And next, decide how you will respond if an incident does occur. You make risk management a guiding principle of your selection, orientation, and training. You hold people accountable for following your procedures. And if something bad does happen, learn what you can from it so it doesn't happen again. So let's break it down. Risk identification. After you've thought of the fall hazards, the back injuries, the working with vulnerable people, etc., dig deeper. Get your best people together and think about what could possibly, your best people might include someone from another organization that's already been through the process. And they might also include someone in a discussion group on LinkedIn, or maybe a group for volunteer managers. What could possibly go wrong? Utilities and mass transit systems have been exploring this question for many years. After Hurricane Sandy, new chapters were added to those plans. And after the ice storm that gridlocked Atlanta several years ago, state and local officials added new chapters to their own disaster plans. I believe one chapter is entitled, "It's Not Good for Everyone to Try to Go Home at Once." At the state prison in Dannemora, New York, they had to revisit their risk management practices a few years ago, especially that part about securing tools so employees can't get them and give them to prisoners with whom they were romantically involved, who then cut holes in steam pipes and escaped from the prison. Yeah, it's pretty unthinkable stuff sometimes, but every organization has unthinkables, including yours. And that's why it's important to ask that threshold question: what could possibly go wrong? To find answers, dig deep. We talked about screening volunteers and training them to prevent a possible assault on someone in their care. Look at it from the other side too. What if a volunteer were assaulted by a client, or by a client's dog, or a client's nephew? Would these kinds of scenarios be possible in your world? Do your clients ever ask volunteers to do unexpected tasks, maybe moving a heavy piece of furniture or reaching something on a high shelf inside the house? There could be a risk exposure there. The risk that the volunteer might fall or suffer a back injury, like we talked about early in the session. Or it could be a situation where a client who is mentally unstable accuses the volunteer of assaulting her or him, or stealing something from the home. Now, what if a volunteer unintentionally violated IRS rules regarding political activity by nonprofits and jeopardized your tax-exempt status? It's easy to make that mistake if you make statements on behalf of your organization that favor a particular political candidate. There's more information at irs.gov for you US people in their section on nonprofits. Now, in brainstorming your risk scenarios, don't stop until you have at least 25. Everyone has that many. Then assign each of those risks a grade of A, B, C, or D for the severity of the risk. The screaming disasters that could bring you down would have a grade of A. To get past with minor inconvenience would be a grade of D. So take a couple of seconds just to think of a grade A disaster for your organization. Write it down. Whatever you're writing down, would it be uncomfortable to discuss as you develop your risk management program? Something involving elder abuse or some other criminal activity, perhaps? If so, and you're still willing to discuss it, you're on the right track. There can't be any taboos in risk management, because if it can't be discussed, it can't be managed. So first, assess the severity of all the risks you can imagine, and then assess the frequency of each, again, using that A, B, C, and D system. But the highest frequency doesn't necessarily mean the most serious risk. If volunteers do home repairs, there's going to be a smashed thumb every now and then. Kind of comes with the territory. So it's a high frequency, but usually a low severity. On the other hand, there could be a very remote risk scenario that's so severe you want to reduce or eliminate it as a top priority. So you just have to consider frequency and severity together as you evaluate each risk. Once you have identified your risks, go to the next step here. What can you do to eliminate or reduce them? Here's an example of how to do that. I mentioned the scenario of a volunteer who's at a client's home and is asked to perform some unexpected task, moving a heavy piece of furniture, reaching something. The volunteer might suffer a back injury or fall, or a client who's mentally unstable might lodge a false claim against the volunteer. So as you think about how to eliminate or reduce the risk, you might come up with an approach like this, and it's a basic approach to all risk management. The principles apply to whatever your volunteers do. Now, for this to work, there needs to be a chain of command, some sort of supervisory structure for your volunteers, whether it's a staff person, a veteran volunteer, or maybe a board member. As I go through this, imagine yourself as the volunteer supervisor. First, you would determine whether volunteers will be allowed to do anything other than their primary responsibilities. If you decide, yes, we're open to other requests that a client might make, your procedure should be to have volunteers call you first, you as the supervisor, before doing whatever it is that they've been asked to do. If the volunteer isn't able to reach you, he or she should put that request on hold until you can discuss it with the volunteer and with the person they're helping, so that you make sure everyone's exactly what the request is. Then, if you say it's okay for the volunteer to do the work, instruct the volunteer to call you once the task is done, even if it's just to leave a voice message saying the job is finished and they're leaving. And one more thing, tell the volunteer to have the client speak on that message too, to confirm that the task has been done. You'll know the volunteer is okay and the person they're helping is satisfied. Now, I know that might seem like way too much communication over moving a desk from the living room to the basement or carrying some bags of mulch to flower beds, but consider the possibility I just mentioned that a volunteer would be falsely accused of assaulting someone. If you have a voice message with both the volunteer and the client confirming that the requested task has been done and the volunteer is leaving, that certainly can help the volunteer's defense if he or she is falsely accused. So do you see how those procedures can help manage your risk that a volunteer will be injured or held liable for injuring someone? You can use a similar approach to apply risk management to virtually every scenario you can imagine when you entertain that what could possibly go wrong question. You're taking time to evaluate the risk, if there is one, making sure communication is clear, the task is done, the volunteer is safe, and the client is satisfied. As you think about how to reduce risks and still offer an array of client services, keep in mind that another volunteer-based organization you know might be better suited for certain activities. You might find you can coordinate services with them. I know some of you probably do this routinely. If you work with elderly clients, for example, you might coordinate with your local area agency on aging in the US. One of our insured organizations developed a relationship with a local college, specifically the football team. And when there was heavy lifting required in a literal sense, they had guys who had volunteered to come over and help with that. They had the physical ability that regular volunteers did not have. So those kinds of relationships can enable you to offer your services and reduce risk at the same time. The system you develop might include training on those IRS rules about political advocacy. There might be a local expert who could address your volunteers on that or create a document so you don't jeopardize your tax exempt status. It could include training in vehicle safety, separation of duties where handling the money is involved, awareness of online scams. Boy, there are new scams every day that someone might accidentally click. It's a ransomware situation, those kinds of things. The key is to think through what your volunteers will be doing, think about what could go wrong, and figure out the most practical way to prevent those outcomes. My association has a lot of resources. Also, if you have a general liability policy, the insurance company that issued it, they have a loss control department. You're paying them, so put them to work for you. They have good resources. You see a reference in the second bullet there on the screen to risk transfer. That just means you buy insurance for serious risks that you cannot eliminate entirely. Our organization specializes in insurance that protects organizations and volunteers in case, despite your best efforts, they get injured or they accidentally injure someone else or damage someone's property, or they're at fault in a vehicle accident. Okay, let's have a quick look at selection, orientation, and training. I know many of you have outstanding programs in that area. Make your volunteer application form work to your advantage in selecting and assigning volunteers. Describe the available assignments, ask about their areas of interest, their special skills, ask about those allergies or other medical conditions or physical limitations. If you have a completed registration form and written job descriptions, it's much easier to match volunteers and assignments. The selection process includes background checks if the volunteer is working with vulnerable clients or handling money. Be careful though. In the US, the Federal Trade Commission has ruled that the Fair Credit Reporting Act applies to volunteers as well as employees. So if you pull a credit history on a volunteer, you have to have a reason to do it that's related to their responsibilities. You can't just do it for all volunteers, regardless of their duties. There are so many federal and state laws. It's really best to rely on a professional firm such as Sterling Volunteers for that. Check motor vehicles records once a year if the volunteer will be driving on behalf of the organization, and track those state inspections. Orientation, so important. One of the risks with volunteer involvement is not communicating what's expected, and your orientation program is a great opportunity to reduce that risk. When people are left to improvise, the results might not be very good. So take improvisation off the table. Does the volunteer know who to report to? Who do they see if they need something or they have a complaint or a problem? Take your time, explain those safety rules, explain record-keeping requirements, all that. Taking time to do it right makes a positive impression on the kind of volunteer you always want to attract. All right, accountability. Correct poor performance and discipline volunteers as needed. Just because they're unpaid, that doesn't mean you can't discipline them and even terminate them if necessary. I know sometimes in a close-knit organization, people are reluctant to question or criticize others, but that reluctance creates a risk. Don't worry about offending the volunteer. As long as you're sincere with them and keep your organization's interest as your first priority, you'll be okay. Also, if you adopt new performance standards, make sure that current volunteers know that those new standards aren't some kind of backdoor criticism of their performance. Just let them know that you're adopting some standard procedures as part of your program to manage risks. So much depends on good communication. All right, now to the last item here. What happens if something happened, or what do you do if something happens despite your best efforts? Have formal procedures for responding to an incident. If a volunteer is injured, injures someone else, or damages someone's property, what are they supposed to do? What's the supervisor supposed to do? Make sure it's written, communicated, and understood. Make sure volunteers know that if there's any situation like this, they're to report it to their supervisor, not to the police, not to a local government agency, but to the supervisor. There's a job to handle it from there. The same is true if there's a complaint about a volunteer. So how does the supervisor know what to do? Well, that goes back to the brainstorming of risk scenarios we talked about and how to deal with all the risks you can imagine. Develop an appropriate response for each risk scenario. Never leave an incident response to the volunteer's discretion. Now, in the case of an injury, once the injured person gets medical attention, get as much information as you can about what caused it. Talk to any witnesses, write down what they say, get their story, their contact information. And if you have a situation where you think a liability claim might arise, don't admit liability, just get the facts and tell the other party you will report it to your insurance company. And do that right away. Claims often are slow to develop, particularly liability claims. Many times, those claims can be traced back to one or two incidents that happened months earlier. So it's important to begin your investigation at the first hint of a problem, and also to put your insurance company on notice. Don't let your attorney decide whether to report the claim. Don't wait for it to blow over. That could jeopardize your coverage. The insurance contract says you must provide timely notification of claims. Don't be in a position of arguing about whether your claim was timely. So after your initial response, see what you can learn from it. Deconstruct what happened. Have a debriefing of everyone. Were your safety procedures being followed? If not, where did they get off track? What should have been done differently? Having that information helps with training to prevent a future occurrence. So that is an overview of managing the risks that go with volunteering. I did not describe the insurance my organization offers to protect volunteers in detail, but if you go to visvolunteers.com, you can get all the information. I will just tell you today that you can protect a volunteer for a year for less than the cost of a good lunch. All right, so we have a couple of minutes, I think, Josie, for any other questions that might have come up.
Yes, two things. One is, if a volunteer has been dismissed or fired from the organization for poor behavior, but then uses their status as a past volunteer to gather personal information from clients, like getting a phone number, are there still liability concerns? For example, if they start harassing a client via text?
You know, I don't think that that has come up in my experience, which only goes to show that there's some new hazard every day. This might be a good reason to, on the front end, during your orientation, to have a non-disclosure agreement, just something that the volunteer signs that says that they will never contact a client outside of their assigned duties as a volunteer, something like that. Whatever, there might be an attorney on your board of directors who could draft something that would protect the organization and give you some recourse if the volunteer did do something like that.
Lots of, I'm not sure if you're looking at the chat too, but William, but there's lots and lots of thank yous. And everyone's going to share with their other members of their organization and things when the recording comes through.
Oh yeah, I'm reading them now. Great.
Yeah.
I'm glad it was useful.
Yeah, lots and lots and lots of thank yous. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up the Zoom now. And thanks to everybody who's still here. Thanks for joining. And thanks again, William. Okay, have a great day,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.